Hello, American literature students. This week we're going to be looking at texts from the Harlem Renaissance. We're staying within the early 20th century. This is a movement that occurs within the broader context of modernism. The dates for the Harlem Renaissance are approximately 1919 through 1940. A lot of historians and scholars will say that the 1920s are the most important decade for the Harlem Renaissance because that's when we see most of the artistic output. And it's a period characterized really by just extraordinary output in all of the arts, not just literature, but music. Think the Jazz Age, and dance and visual arts. But obviously for the purposes of our class, we'll be focusing on the literature side of things. So here's the definition that I want you to keep in mind this week when we're looking at these texts. The Harlem Renaissance was an artistic movement with distinctly social and political goals, more so than the other things that we've looked at so far. One goal was to protest racism, to call attention to the conditions of living under racism and segregation and what that was like, but also to affirm the beauty and dignity of African Americans. This is a movement that's very much forward-looking and centered on the contributions that African Americans make to our culture. Some historical context first. Really can't underestimate the legacy of slavery and anti-literacy laws that had kept African Americans out of the American literary tradition to a pretty large degree. We talked about this in the first week when we discussed the canon. And so over the period of the course that we've been looking at this semester, we've seen how more and more African American writers of color have access to the canon, to the literary establishment as they gain more power. We also have Jim Crow laws and segregation. And amidst all of these really terrible conditions that African Americans were living under much of the time, we have the rise of Black intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Alain Locke, who are calling on African Americans to rise up and to show their contributions to the world. We have also growing audiences, more and more people, Black and white, and all across the spectrum, who are interested in reading the work of African Americans. So more publishing opportunities open up. And then there's the Great Migration, a period when many African Americans were moving from the rural South to urban centers in the North. So cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York City, specifically Harlem. Harlem becomes the center of Black urban life, according to scholars like Alain Locke. Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance obviously is rooted here, but there are a number of figures in this movement who aren't necessarily working in or from Harlem. Okay, let's look at some themes, some things that these writers wrote about. They wrote quite a lot about being Black in America, quite simply what it's like to be Black in this country, the beauty and the dignity of Black life. And they also wrote about diversity of experiences. They didn't want to write only about, well, I suppose what we'd call respectability politics right now, and the higher, more elite classes of African American life. They wanted to give us the full spectrum of African American life and the beauty that can be found in all of those experiences. As I mentioned earlier, they also wrote about racism and its effects. One of the things that these writers have in common with other modernist writers is exploring the idea of marginality or isolation, being alienated from society, society itself being an alienating force. And these writers also wrote about traditional literary and poetic subjects, and you'll see that this week too. Okay, so one of the debates within or between writers from the Harlem Renaissance was the extent to which to experiment. And you'll notice a lot of experimentation in some of the writing or some of the poetry that you read. Hughes was known for his jazz poetry, for example. Langston Hughes definitely showed the influence of blues in terms of the rhythms that he used, the subjects that he used. But other writers wondered whether traditional forms were a better way to reach a larger audience. Um, you saw yourself how alienating uh, poetry like T.S. Eliot's can be, right? When he's using all these different languages and a ton of footnotes and a lot of very elusive references. You're not going to reach a whole lot of people that way. So traditional forms, some writers thought, would have been a better way to reach a wider audience. Another source of debate was the extent to which to use the vernacular, ordinary speech dialect. You'll notice this when you read the Zora Neale Hurston stories, her use of dialect. Richard Wright accused her of putting on basically a minstrel show for white readers. But other people thought that she was doing a good job of realistically capturing the way that rural black folks in the South would have spoken. So keep those debates in mind as you read. This was not necessarily, this was definitely not a movement that was homogenous. There was a lot of diversity and a lot of different approaches to art. Okay, so one of the traditional forms that you'll see this week when you read is the sonnet. We talked a little about the sonnet last week when you read Design by Robert Frost. So you know a little bit about this. I'm going to give you a little more detail here too. So the word sonnet is derived from the Italian word meaning little song. And traditionally the sonnet was used as a love poem for centuries. Typically courtly, unrequited love was the subject of the sonnet. Shakespeare wrote about his unrequited love in all of his sonnets. The sonnet consists of 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and if you can't quite remember what iambic pentameter is, you should review last week's materials. But 14 lines, and there are many varieties. But the two most popular traditionally are the Italian sonnet and the English sonnet. The Italian sonnet, based on the poet Petrarch, consisted of an octave, or 8 lines, plus a sestet, 6 lines, so 8 plus 6. Whereas the English or Shakespearean sonnet broke down into 3 quatrains, in other words, 3 sets of 4 lines each, plus a final couplet. There are other varieties too, and other ways to experiment with rhyme scheme and meter, but these are the two most popular. And the sonnet traditionally had what's called a volta, which is Italian for turn. The volta is a rhetorical shift, the point at which the sonnet sort of shifts purposes. In the Italian sonnet, the volta would occur after the octave. So at the beginning of the sestet, the poet might put a twist on things or try to answer a question that was raised in the first part of the sonnet. Often the volta or the turn is signaled by the words but or yet. So let's look at this sonnet that's assigned this week by County Cullen, a major poet in the Harlem Renaissance. It's called Yet Do I Marvel. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind, and did he stoop to quibble, could tell us why the little buried mole continues blind, why flesh that mirrors him must some day die, make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit, declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Inscrutable his ways are, and immune to catechism by a mind too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. So if we look at how this sonnet breaks down, we have a rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B. So kind and blind are the A, Y and die are the B, C, D, C, D, and then E, E, F, F, G, G. So this breaks down into an octave of 8 lines, and then a sestet of 6 lines. Okay, so the octave here is in blue, the sestet is in red. Normally, in this kind of sonnet, an Italian sonnet made up of an 8-line octave and then a sestet, the turn would be right here. But here we see the word yet in this last octave. So let's look at what Cullen might be saying here. Notice how he starts off the sonnet by saying, I doubt not. And he talks about what he doesn't doubt, right? He doesn't doubt God's goodness. He doesn't doubt that God is kind. And if God bothered to quibble with us, if he bothered with such small things, in line 2, he could tell us why these things happen. And then he begins a series of mysterious things, right? Why does he create an animal that's blind? Why does he create us in his image only for us to die? Why are we mortal? And then he makes reference to Tantalus and Sisyphus. If you don't know those references, take a look at those. I think our book has footnotes too that explain them. So in the octave then, he's establishing that the things that he doesn't doubt, including these little mysterious things that he lays out for us. And then in the sestet, inscrutable his ways are, he goes on to explain that we'll never be able to understand his ways, right? Our minds are too occupied with little things to understand his awesome brain. But here's the couplet. After he's established all these things that he doesn't doubt, and after he's established that his ways are beyond our understanding, he says, yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. In the discussions this week, I would love for you to attempt to answer what you think he means by that. What does that last couplet mean? What is Cullen saying in that last, in those last 2 lines? All right, so this week we're going to be reading quite a bit of poetry. The reading list might look daunting, but most of these poems are very short, not like The Wasteland or even Proof Rock. So don't let that reading list intimidate you. We'll be reading poems by some of the major writers in the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes, Cullen, McKay, Bennett, and Johnson. You'll also be reading prose fiction by Toomer and Hurston. So read through everything first to get the ideas, and when you're reading the poetry, I want you then also to think about the form and where you see experimentation and where you see traditional forms. The readings, an updated reading list and an updated list of deadlines are listed in D2L. So that's what I have for you this week. Enjoy the readings, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reactions and your insights on D2L.